Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Survey and Spatial CSLB Standards Review webinar. Our presenters today for this webinar are Neale Faulkner and Craig McInnes. Neale is a senior licensed cadastral surveyor and has been a member of the Cadastral Surveyors Licensing Board since 2013. He is known to many people through his expertise with the Unit Titles Act and the various presentations he has given from a survey perspective on this topic. Neale has led the current standards review by the board and is here today to give a presentation on the proposed new standards, including the rationale behind them, a general overview and detail of the substantive changes that have been made. Craig is also joining us on this webinar today and he will answer any questions that come through. Just a note to everybody that you can pop questions via the live stream there, and we will copy and paste those through to Craig, who will answer these throughout the presentation. Craig is a licensed cadastral surveyor working at Fox & Associates Limited in Christchurch. He began his career with the former Department of Survey and Land Information in Gisborne and Christchurch and registered as a surveyor in 1993, gaining experience in Crown land and large rural cadastral surveys. For the last 20 years, he has broadened his expertise in all aspects of the land subdivision process, and he was appointed to the board in 2016. I'd now like to welcome Neale Faulkner to present to everybody online.
Good morning, everybody. It's Neale Faulkner here. So this presentation, the purpose of it really is to inform people about the changes that we've made to the standards and highlight a few of those with the view that if people have concerns, etc., they will make a submission, which we will be encouraging. So just very quickly, here's a photo of the board, the current board. Who are we? We'll start in the front centre is Vicky Nalder, the chairperson. To her left, or as we're looking at it to the right, is Phil Napper. He is our secretary, licensed cadastral surveyor and very experienced. To Vicky's right, or the left of the screen, bottom left, is Nick Davies. Nick's a licensed cadastral surveyor in Rotorua, and he is a substitute member on the board. So in other words, if someone can't attend a board meeting, he steps in. Immediately behind him, so we'll go from sort of left to right as you're looking at it, is Jane DeVal. She is a full-time board member. She is our lay member. She knows nothing about surveying and keeps us in line from a public perspective. She brings with her a wealth of experience in boards and etc. Next to her is Anselm Harnan, the Surveyor General. In the middle is Colin McIlwain, surveyor in Christchurch, in Wellington. Craig McInnes, you've been introduced to him already, and myself with a beard beginning of last year, which I've now lost. So that's us. So what's the board's role? Very quickly before we get into it, we're empowered by the Cadastral Survey Act 2002, and among our functions and duties, we are required to issue and update standards so that persons applying for licenses or renewal of licenses must meet those. We also, the standards must relate to the competencies to meet the standards set by the Surveyor General. And also the standards must relate to the legislative requirements for the subdivision of land. So that's basically our duty to do that, and part of what we're doing at the moment falls square in the middle of all of that. So why review the standards? Originally drafted in 2002, some minor tweaks through to the current standards of 2013, and we felt it was time that they needed to be updated and reviewed. The board recognises standards don't always meet the outcomes required for assessing the competency of licensed cadastral surveyors, primarily by virtue of experience over the years since 2002. The government requires that the standards be presented in secondary legislation format, so we needed to update them anyway. And also business practice and technology has changed considerably, and while the basic competencies do not alter, the board considered the standards needed to be updated. So new standards, what's changed? I've highlighted in red as we go through these slides the prompts to what's changed. So you'll see that as we go on through. So basically, in summary, as I said before, the format's completely different. It's now in secondary legislation format. The categories of license applications, together with the requirements thereof, have been clarified and made a lot more succinct than they were. They have been expanded to cover deficiencies that have been highlighted by the board's experience in dealing with both the examination process and complaints of professional conduct. The competencies have been updated to include 2 new categories: professional misconduct and communication skills, which we felt were deficiencies in the previous standards. And I'll talk more about those later. So the new standards, there are 4 sections. Essentially, part 1 is the contents, includes the title, commencement, purpose, and interpretation, like most legislation. Second part is the introduction, describes the standards and sets out what is required to be demonstrated to be a licensed cadastral surveyor. Part 2, or the third section, relates to the standards for licensing themselves and sets out the requirements and processes which the board applies when considering applications for initial licenses, renewal of licenses, and reapplications for a license. And then in Schedule 1 are the competencies. There are 8 areas of competence that form the basis for the standards for the licensing of cadastral surveys. So, interpretation, a new term being assessment panel or panel has been introduced, whose function is primarily to assess the competency of graduate survey applicants. This role is currently being fulfilled by Surveying and Spatial New Zealand under the guidance of the Licensing Board. And the board has also recently set up a committee made up of 2 of the board members to liaise directly with the assessment panel on a regular basis to provide guidance and input to ensure that the assessment process performed by the panel meets the standards for licensing. So that is a mechanism by which we are becoming more intimately involved with the assessment panel. So are there any questions so far?
No questions at this stage, Neale.
No questions? Perfect. Okay, I'll carry on. So let's have a look at the new standards. Part 1, the introduction. This describes the standards and sets out what a person is required to demonstrate to be a licensed cadastral surveyor, as I said before. This information was contained in the previous standards, but not as succinctly. There's been no real changes. So nothing really different in the introduction. Part 2, licensing. Part 2 sets out the requirements and processes which the board applies when considering applications. It includes a section on the application process and then details the various classes of application for a license, which are namely initial applications for a license from somebody who has not been licensed ever before, renewal of a license, someone who has an existing license and is renewing it on an annual basis, and applications by previously licensed surveyors. In other words, those people who have their license has lapsed for a period of time and they want to get licensed again. The requirements for each class are then clearly and succinctly described. So let's have a look at initial applications. 3 classes of applicant, namely a graduate surveyor, an Australian licensed or registered cadastral surveyor, or an overseas qualified cadastral surveyor. So graduates, at the moment we have stipulated a 4-year tertiary education qualification, degree or equivalent assessed by the Bureau of Assessment of Overseas Qualifications. 2 years post-grad training under a licensed cadastral surveyor, including 1 year practical land subdivision and boundary definition experience. A certificate of competency less than
Hi everyone, sorry, there seems to be a little bit of a glitch with Neale's system at the moment. If you can just bear with us, please, we'll get that sorted. Right, hi everyone, sorry, we seem to have completely lost Neale. Can you please stay online and we'll get this sorted in a minute. Thank you, thanks for your patience. Hi everyone. Look, I am very sorry we are experiencing some issues with the Wi-Fi for our main presenter, Neale Faulkner, but I am going to hand over to Craig McInnes now, who will follow up on the webinar. And I also see we have some questions that have come through, so I'm just going to fire those through to Craig, who will answer them for you. So I'll now hand over to Craig McInnes.
Morning, everyone. Didn't quite expect to come off the bench this way, but great to have you all with us anyway. As a bit of a filler, I thought I might just clarify a little bit more about the relationship with CSLB and Surveying Spatial New Zealand. I guess thinking particularly for young graduates who might be watching, just thinking how the whole process works for them. And Neale touched on that with, the standards are required. We need to conduct examinations of graduates to check that they've got the competencies required. And that is, since 2002, that's typically been outsourced almost by default in a way to Survey and Spatial New Zealand as part of their membership process. And so we needed to ensure from our side of the fence that there was a very clear pathway for graduates to become licensed. And I guess the first step in making sure that that's clear is to make sure that our standards are clear, are up to date, and set out those expectations of the bare minimum requirements. We don't get into the detail of what the projects exactly will be, or the setting of the exam, the laws and regs and things like that. That's a level of detail that's worked out in conjunction with us, but by the admissions panel, the examinations panel. So so that's kind of why just wanted to make sure that people understand the different roles that the board and the Survey and Spatial have in this role. So I guess it's easier to think of like a, we kind of contract out that part of the process to another entity. It could be anybody. We could choose to do it completely in-house if we wanted to. But at this stage, Survey and Spatial have the infrastructure to support that, and so that's how we do it. But underpinning all of this, there needs to be the standards that set out what's required, and then the competencies which are clearly articulated, up to date in terms of modern requirements, and that articulate what we've learned over the years as a board, where there have been some gaps when surveyors have come unstuck. So there's a question there about the time frame for the experience. It's still 2 years, but that at least 1 year of that 2 years is spent on boundary definition survey. So surveyors get involved in all sorts. If you look at the competencies, there's a whole range of competencies there that whether you get involved in topographic surveys or precise monitoring or whatever it might be. We're not talking about increasing the amount of time or experience that's been required. If you look at there's a question there about technicians becoming licensed. There is an avenue there. If you look at clause 10, subclauses 2 and 3, if you look at those carefully, there is the potential for someone who hasn't done a 4-year degree to have a pathway through there, but it's very much a case-by-case basis. There may be a need to upskill extra tertiary training for an agreed level, and then the experience is really, really important as well. And then a person like that wouldn't follow through the normal certificate of competency process like a graduate would, but there's a possibility there for that kind of thing to occur. So we're really keen to get some feedback in the submissions. Have we kind of got that right? Just try, so hopefully that covers off that kind of thing. Again, so Australian surveyors wanting to relicense who had previously been a New Zealand licensed surveyor. I guess it depends on which level was the easiest route. If you had if you're currently an Australian licensed surveyor coming in, then the reciprocity thing carries over, and I imagine that would be the very easiest way to get your license back, rather than reapplying as someone who had lost their license. At the end of the day, it's all about have you kept your competencies up, and can you operate competently as a licensed cadastral surveyor in the New Zealand system. Another question there about the supervision of a licensed cadastral surveyor, the supervising surveyor making a declaration. That's probably a level of detail that the standards won't get into, but that is, you know, from memory, that kind of thing happens. There should be someone signing off that the experience has been gained by the candidate. But yeah, if you feel that it's something that should be sort of spelled out in black and white in the standards, yeah, be really pleased to receive a submission on that. I think that hopefully that's most of the questions that have come in to date. Really keen to get some more. I'll just another question there, consideration given to CPD requirement for license renewal. Well, that is required now. Well, license renewal. So I'm not sure whether we want to jump ahead just yet. Can I just check in with Jenny and just see where we're at with Neale?
Hi, Craig. Unfortunately, I still can't get hold of Neale. There's obviously major issues with his Wi-Fi. So,
all right. Yeah, okay. So some of these questions coming, just jumping ahead a wee bit, but that's fine. Let's roll with it. So, okay, CPD requirements for a license renewal. So the license renewal at the moment, if we carry on through the requirements, the evidential requirements. So at the moment, if you're lodging 3 cadastral survey data sets over the last 2 years, then that's, you know, kind of the easiest way to get the renewal, because you're obviously still doing cadastral survey data sets. So we've changed this slightly. So there's a minimum of 3 approved cadastral data sets in the 2-year period. The data sets must have involved boundary definition, and one of them must have involved the subdivision of land. So you can't use survey-only data sets. And I guess that is reflecting, you may remember in the first slide that Neale said, the standards are all about showing that we have competence in undertaking surveys in terms of the Surveyor General's rules, but also that we understand the subdivision process insofar as it affects the cadastral surveying. And so by including a subdivision plan in that evidential requirement, will show that you've been involved in that kind of process. At this stage, we haven't required a CPD requirement for the if you like, the basic license renewals, but that is certainly a requirement for those who haven't submitted the data sets. They therefore need to prove by other means that they've kept up to speed with cadastral surveying. Again, you know, we've got, I guess, 600 or 700 licensed cadastral surveyors. We've got a process. We want to keep things as simple as possible for the majority of people, but also making sure that surveyors are obviously still maintaining their competencies. So would appreciate some feedback there if we haven't quite got that right. So someone asking about a roadmap for getting licensed. Communication with Phil Napper is outstanding, and he would be the one the secretary of the board. He would be the one to go to had you some specific questions about your situation. So please get in touch with him. But I think Neale's online, so I will hand back to him.
Thank you, Craig, for answering those questions that have come through. We now have Neale Faulkner back online, so I'll just pop him back up on the screen here along with his presentations. Sorry, we seem to be having a few more issues with Neale with the screen freezing. If everybody can just be with us for a minute, please. We'll just see if we can get this working. Oh, hello, Neale.
Hello, how are you? Sorry, I missed out. I'm not 100% sure where it cut out, where my link dropped off, but I don't know where I need to go back to. Perhaps Craig can help me with that.
Yes, I think you're a little bit further back up, Neale. You were talking through the graduate process.
Oh, okay, cool. And I cut out at the graduate process?
Yeah, just after that. Yeah, so that the one more further up, I think, just to double check. Yeah, that was certainly, I think you're midway through that.
Okay, so I'll carry on from here. Okay, I trust everybody's tuned in. I apologise, my internet connection dropped out here, so I'm using my phone now, so hopefully that'll work just as well. So, carrying on. I think I dropped out. So initial applications, sorry if I've repeated some stuff here, because I'm not 100% sure where I dropped out. So new standards, initial applications, 3 classes of applicant: graduate, cadastral surveyor, Australian licensed or registered, or overseas qualified cadastral surveyor. So if for graduates, a 4-year tertiary education qualification, degree or equivalent, assessed by the Bureau of Assessment of Overseas Qualifications, 2 years of postgrad training under a licensed cadastral surveyor, including 1 year practical land subdivision and boundary definition, and a certificate of competency less than 2 years old when you apply for your license, and a certificate of competency within 3 years of passing your laws and regs or cadastral law examination, and projects and an oral examination and interview. Pretty much the standard normal stuff that we've had to date, but we would really like some feedback on some of these numbers. If you think they're too much or too little, that would be really great by the submissions process. So initial applications, Australian qualified surveyors, we have a reciprocal agreement between Australia and New Zealand. It dates back a considerable number of years. It basically means that if you're qualified in either Australia or New Zealand, you can get the reciprocal qualification in either Australia or New Zealand, and you need a letter of accreditation from the relevant board, and you must have no disciplinary action or professional conduct, either existing or under investigation. So if you're an overseas qualified surveyor, 4 years tertiary education qualification, degree or equivalent. And if you don't, then additional studies, and you need to provide details of your professional qualification. Again, no disciplinary action or professional misconduct, and a full CV with additional information. Also, possible practical experience under a licensed cadastral surveyor, maybe some tertiary education course, additional laws and regs or cadastral law exam, and some projects and oral examination are all additional stuff that may be required depending on whether the board is satisfied or not that that person is competent. So license renewals, they apply to the renewal of existing, sorry, I'm going to license renewals now. So we're talking about existing, current, non-expired license holders. They need to provide evidence that the skills in cadastral surveying has been maintained as required by the competencies, and this is detailed in the evidential requirements, which I'll talk about shortly. The board recognises that some surveyors specialise in different aspects of cadastral surveying, but despite that, the board requires all licensed cadastral surveyors to maintain their knowledge, understanding and abilities to meet the competencies. In exceptional circumstances, we will consider an application that is made 3 months after the license has expired, but it's exceptional circumstances only. An example might be a family relative that was deceased overseas, and you had to go and attend to all of that, and you missed the critical date. But generally speaking, you must, if you've got an existing license, you must reapply for the new annual one before your current one expires. So the evidential requirements for existing license holders: if you're lodging data sets, complete a minimum of 3 approved cadastral survey data sets in the preceding 2-year period is considered, unless the board decides otherwise, to have met the level of competence or renewal. All those data sets, those 3 data sets, must have involved boundary definition, and at least one must have involved the subdivision of land. No survey only data sets. So the evidential requirements: if you're not lodging data sets, you have to certify that in the preceding 2-year period you've practiced cadastral surveying in New Zealand or another jurisdiction in which similar competencies in cadastral surveying are required, or you've maintained your knowledge, understanding and ability by means of private study, seminars, workshops or other means in relation to the competencies, and you need to provide evidence to the board thereof. If you've not practiced in New Zealand, then while holding your current license, you must provide a description of the means by which knowledge and understanding of the cadastral surveying in New Zealand has been maintained. So the evidential requirements continued. In addition to all of that, the board may conduct an oral examination in the form of an interview if it considers it necessary or desirable to do so. Where the board has, in the 3 years preceding the application, received and sought comment on a notice from the Surveyor General under section 7(1)(d), this relates to significant failures in terms of the Surveyor General's rules, the board may consider the application in greater detail and may require the applicant to provide further evidence to support the application. In other words, that further evidence needs to demonstrate that their competence, that they are competent, or their competencies are improving to a satisfactory standard. So previously licensed surveyors, this relates to people that have held a license but currently do not, and they're outside the 3-month exemption period if that were to apply in exceptional circumstances. So for those people who want to get their license back again, they must be able to demonstrate that they have maintained or re-established their knowledge, understanding and ability to undertake cadastral surveys in New Zealand to the required level of competence for the issue of a license. And to meet the required level of competence, the applicant must provide a comprehensive summary of their cadastral surveying experience and details of any ongoing education or training in the competencies during the last 3 years, and the names of 2 current LCSs as referees. One of those must be able to attest to the applicant's most recent cadastral surveying, and one of them is not to be a current employee or work colleague. In other words, no conflicts of interest. And also any other evidence of the applicant's current or most recent cadastral surveying experience that the board may require. The board may also require the applicant to undertake a period of cadastral survey work undertaken under the supervision of a licensed cadastral surveyor and pass any written or oral examination or attend an interview. So we got to some questions where I thought we'd lost off, where I finished off last time, and I apologise for the delay, but maybe there's some questions that have flowed out of that Craig hasn't already answered. So I'll hand you over to Craig.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Neil. Yeah, there's a few questions that have rolled in. So again, a question about technician surveyors who have got a qualification from overseas, for example, the UK. You won't find a detailed roadmap of what each person should do who doesn't kind of follow that normal route. So all of these, if someone is in that position, the very first step is to contact the secretary, explain your situation, provide the details that you've got, and then the board needs to make a decision in your particular case about what, well, firstly, does your qualifications stack up with the BAOQ, and if not, then what would be a pathway from there for you to gain a license, because every situation is slightly different. So we can't just kind of easily put a roadmap in a box flow part type thing for those sort of situations. So first step, contact the secretary and get that conversation going. The question about have we thought about increasing the number of data sets for the evidential requirements for relicensing? No, we didn't think about increasing the number, but we certainly want to increase the complexity of those data sets and make sure that they weren't just going to be survey data only data sets, that they had boundary definition and all of them, and that one of them actually involved the subdivision of land, a land transfer plan, the subdivision of land. So that's as far as we've got with that thinking there. A question about the length of time after you've sat laws and regs to get your certificate of competency. We're suggesting 3 years in the draft standards, whereas the question was thinking that it was previously 5. I'm not aware of what that was. Our thinking was that we didn't want to make this more onerous than what it was. I thought it was only 2 years after, but I'm quite happy to be proven wrong there. And certainly, it's just getting that balance right. Legislation does change, and what was, if you leave it too long, it's no longer kind of relevant if that legislation had to change. So it's a bit of a balancing act. 3 years felt right to the board, so that's what we've gone with. But if there's strong ideas either way on that, we would value the feedback. But we certainly weren't planning to make things more onerous than what they were. If it really is 5 at the moment, then we can review that. For someone who has currently passed their laws and regs, and they get caught by a change in the time frame, again, we're not wanting to kind of catch people out, and we would, I guess we could consider things on a case-by-case basis if that was the case. Why are the requirements to relicense higher than for initially licensed? I don't think that they're not intended to be higher. It's the initial license is where you've really got to go through the effort to prove that you are competent. The requirements to relicense, a lot of it depends on how long it has been, and so there's a little bit of discretion for the board to kind of, in some cases it might be that someone's been overseas for a year and they've come back, and so the half-life of their knowledge is still pretty intact. Whereas if you've been away from the game for 20 years, then actually, we need to know that you are back in the zone with the competencies after such a long time away. So I guess the standards have to kind of allow for the worst case scenario, but there is some discretion in there as well to, where it's evident that someone still has maintained their competencies for them to get through. So I hope that answers that question. I don't see any other further questions, so we'll hand back to Neale to carry on to the next section.
Okay, so let's have a look at the competencies now. So in summary, there's an introduction in Schedule 1, which clearly breaks down the competencies into 3 sections that form the basis of the standards. While the first 2 sections were included in the previous standards, the proposed new standards clarify and in some cases expand those competencies where there needs to be an understanding of various concepts and an ability to perform certain tasks. So the third section is new and has been added to include professional conduct and communication skills, which I mentioned before, both of which are considered deficiencies in the previous standards. So that's the competencies in summary. So in order to be able to apply the Surveyor General's rules for cadastral survey, an LCS must have a sound understanding of surveying in New Zealand. This entails being competent in survey measurement, land tenure systems, boundary definition, and land information systems. To be able to implement the legislative requirements for the subdivision of land, an LCS must have knowledge of and abilities in the resource management planning process and land development engineering principles. They don't need to be a full-blown civil engineer, design engineer. They just need to have a good understanding of engineering principles. So, and to act in a professional manner, a licensed cadastral surveyor must have and be able to demonstrate high standards of professional conduct and communication skills. So let's have a look at the competencies in a little bit more detail, each of the 8 categories. Survey measurement. So I'll start off in each of these categories by summarising what the requirements are in terms of survey measurement, and then I'll go into some detail about what's changed. So the foundation of survey measurement is a sound knowledge and ability to apply all the principles of surveying appropriate to cadastral surveying. This requires an understanding of the principles of cadastral, geodetic, topographic, and various abilities, including the addition of the following. So there's expanded abilities in this section to include interpret historical survey data, present spatial data correctly and unambiguously, apply analysis and adjustments to not only to horizontal and vertical survey measurements and vertical datums, record and document measurements and other survey observations accurately and unambiguously, and apply appropriate quality assurance processes in relation to survey measurements. We've excluded specific methodologies such as GNSS and photogrammetry, etc., for future-proofing reasons. So the new standards don't refer to any specific methodologies. What we've retained use and calibrate survey equipment correctly. Now, we'd love some feedback on this. The calibrate bit, of course, instrumentation is becoming more and more digital, and most surveyors would not be calibrating their GPS necessarily. They would probably be sending it back to the manufacturer or the supplier to do tests, etc. And we'd love some feedback on the use of survey equipment, because we do recognise the fact that there are quite a few cadastral surveyors, licensed cadastral surveyors out there who don't necessarily use the survey equipment on a day-to-day basis. So some feedback on that would be great. So land tenure systems. So the basis of the land tenure requirement is to describe the rights or title by which land is held. Land tenure systems provide for the creation or transfer of interests in land. This requires an understanding of the law and administrative systems relating to land held under the New Zealand legislation and the related record systems, and the survey and tenure information that is processed in those systems. So updated understandings to include land tenure and the operation of different land tenure systems, implications of legislation to land use, subdivision and cadastral surveying, historical and current processes for the disposition of land from the Crown, the Registrar General's of Land's role and responsibilities so far as they interact with cadastral surveying, the role of the Maori Land Court in the administration of Maori land, and we've expanded the abilities to include applying different types of surveys and their purposes in relation to land tenure and subdivision of land, applying the concepts of indefeasibility of title, real property rights and legislation affecting interests and rights in land, and understanding the status of land and the associated interests and rights. So, next competency, boundary definition. So, accurate boundary location and correct definition in all three dimensions is fundamental to cadastral surveying. This requires a sound knowledge and ability to apply correctly the hierarchy of evidence applicable to the definition of cadastral boundaries and the ability to resolve discrepancies and gaps in that evidence. Knowledge of topographic, marine, and hydrographic surveying is required to relate water, marine, and other natural features to boundaries and interests in land. So the revised understandings include the Crown's responsibility to provide a reliable and accurate cadaster, the information required and the processes involved in claiming rights to land, engineering and building design and construction as far as they relate to the definition of cadastral boundaries and the rights associated with buildings, services and structures. And we've expanded and updated the abilities to include apply the principles of boundary definition, interpret and apply Maori Land Court orders, comply with the Surveyor General's rules, and determine the position of new boundaries, including natural, water or regular and permanent structure boundaries with respect to existing boundaries. And we've introduced lines of occupation, interests and property rights. And describe and determine boundaries of interest and property rights within the marine and coastal area. Furthermore, balance the interest of current, future and neighbouring affected parties in relation to boundary definition when defining and describing interests in land. And also interpret cadastral survey data sets, including field notes, reports and other supporting documentation from the cadastral record. So next competency, land information systems. So competency in land information systems requires an understanding the application of land and spatial information technology. Introduced the spatial information technology to this as well. To cadastral surveying and the subdivision of land. It also requires the ability to use relevant information and enhance information systems with new and accurate data sets. So revised understandings, including the basic principles of spatial information systems, management and operations, their development processes, and the application of cadastral information to these systems. Amended abilities in this competency to include determine the inherent limitations of different sources of data and interpret them correctly. So next competency, the planning process. So in the planning process, competency as an LCS requires an ability to understand subdivision consents and their implementation. So there is revised understandings, including the parts of the Resource Management Act and associated legislation relevant to the subdivision of land, the relevant national standards we've introduced, district and regional plans, and other statutory and regulatory documents that affect the subdivision of land, the influence of other legal interests in land that may affect the completion of the subdivision process and the issue of records of title. We've expanded the abilities to include interpret all types of resource consents and define the spatial rights to give effect to them. Interpret the conditions of a subdivision consent and understand the processes required to satisfy them. So engineering principles, the highlight being on the word principles. So competency in engineering principles requires an ability to understand the subdivision engineering principles and requirements necessary to comply with the regulatory consents for safe, stable and sustainable subdivision and avoid inappropriate development because of natural hazards as required by the RMA. This includes an appreciation of the necessary measures to mitigate potential land instability, flooding and other detrimental effects of earthworks and land development. Competency in engineering principles also requires an understanding of all aspects of access, roading, wastewater and stormwater, water reticulation and other services as they relate to land subdivision. So there are amended and expanded understandings to include the basic principles of soil properties, land stability, inundation and other natural hazards as they relate to subdivision of land, the basic principles of earthworks, access, roads, wastewater, stormwater, drainage, water supply systems and the provision of utility services, again as they relate to the subdivision of land, and the types of regulatory documents that control the provision of access and services to a subdivision, such as national standards, district and regional plans, local authority codes of practice, etc. So we've got some amended abilities in that competency to include interpret and engineering design and constructed works to the extent necessary to identify where a design or a constructed work may be incompatible with the topography, the subdivision consent, existing rights and interests, or existing cadastral boundaries. Correctly define the boundaries of all titles, easements, and other rights or restrictions to ensure the proper extent of ownership and protection of rights associated with the constructed works. So the last two competencies are new ones. First one, professional conduct. We felt it was really important that public confidence in the cadastral survey and land tenure systems requires licensed cadastral surveyors to maintain and act in accordance with high standards of professionalism within their area of expertise or specialisation. Accordingly, the competencies required in professional conduct are the abilities to act professionally and honestly at all times to maintain public confidence in the cadastral survey and land tenure systems, and develop, maintain, and apply systems of professional practice management and effective quality assurance to all aspects of a cadastral survey to ensure compliance with the Surveyor General's rules. This in particular is an element where we find where people start having troubles with failing to comply with the Surveyor General's rules. A lot of it boils down to poor professional practice management methods and non-existent or really poor quality assurance processes. So we're trying to raise the bar in that regard, and also actively supervise and be responsible for work undertaken on a cadastral survey by any other person. As you know, when an LCS signs a data set, it's under their supervision. They need to be supervise them very well and be responsible for their work. And finally, to participate in ongoing professional education and development in relation to cadastral surveying. So the next new competency, and the last one, is communication skills. So we believe that licensed cadastral surveyors should have good communication skills, both oral and written, so that they can clearly describe cadastral and other interests in land, and where necessary, describe complex technical concepts to non-technical people in a professional manner. Accordingly, the competencies required in communication skills are the ability to communicate clearly and concisely in English, the minimum standard being the equivalent standard for university entry in New Zealand. We would love some feedback on our inclusion of the word English subsequent to the final draft that you currently see. We have thought that we should be replacing the word English with New Zealand, accepted New Zealand language, so that would include Maori and English. But we'd love some commentary back on that. Write logical and unambiguous documents and reports to a professional standard. So that's the competencies. I'll hand over to Craig if there's been any questions in relation to those. But before I go, before I do that, submissions. So that's basically the end of our presentation, apart from Craig answering a few questions. So what we'd like to do is have your say. The board really encourages you to make a submission on the proposed standards. Your comments are invaluable and will ensure that the new standards are robust and comprehensive. To assist you in that, a PDF copy of this presentation is available on the Cadastral Survey Licensing Board's website under News and Publications. And you can find that on the home page, either in the drop-down box from, there's an About drop-down box. If you go into that, you can see News and Publications, or if you go right to the bottom of the home page, you will see News and Publications as well. If you're a licensed cadastral surveyor, the preferred method of making a submission is through the CSLB website. So if you're an LCS, sign in, go to the members area and upload your pre-prepared submission. Alternatively, or if you're not an LCS, email your submission to the secretary at CSLB, and submissions close in just under 2 weeks' time on Monday the 29th of March. So we would love to see some submissions. So back to Craig for some questions and answers.
Thanks, Neil. Just dealing with the questions that have come in. Thanks very much for putting them through, everyone. So there's just clarifying a little bit more about the referee's involvement in the evidential requirements. So just remember, whether it's an initial license or a reapplication, the referee's statement is a very small part of a much wider body of evidence that we look at. If it's an initial application, there's the certificate of competency, which is made up of the projects and the exams. There's all the experience required, there's a degree and all that sort of stuff. So the referee involved in an initial license, it's expected that they've been the supervising, mentoring surveyor through that process and will have an intimate knowledge of how that they have reached those levels of competencies in their opinion. So that's why there's kind of one person involved there, because I guess many graduates may only have one supervising surveyor that they have worked with. For a license reapplication, again, we're looking at CPD, we're looking at years of experience that back in the game of cadastral surveying, and we're looking, for the referees again to as another source of evidence, but it's a small part of a much wider body of evidence. And I think the question there that a referee is answering in that situation is something along the lines of, is there do you have any reason to believe to think that a license should not be issued to this person? So we can appreciate for some people that we don't really know how good someone is unless we've worked intimately with them in cadastral surveying. So it can be a bit of a tricky process. But the referee is really coming to the board saying, look, there's no reason I can think of why they couldn't be issued with a license. The referee is not saying that they are fully competent in all of those competencies. So just hopefully that kind of clarifies those questions there. Some questions about the assessment panel and survey and spatial, whether they can change laws and regs. Again, the certificate of competency regime, the projects and the laws and regs, etc., is something that the board would be involved in through that subcommittee. Nothing would happen without our knowledge. And in terms of the format of the laws and regs exam itself, again, that's a level of detail that wouldn't be handled by the standards. It's handled by the assessment panel in conjunction with the board, and should reflect best practice advice from the academics in the field. It's not the place for the standards to deal with that. And again, the questions come up about the 3-year time frame for someone who has set the exam. So the standards will come into effect once they've been, the submissions have closed and we've ratified it. There will be a date at the end when they come into effect. We're certainly happy to consider a submission on perhaps some transition provisions for those who have perhaps set laws and regs and passed it, but get caught out by a change in time frame. Keen to hear your feedback on that. Question in one of the competencies about the calibration of equipment. Understanding the limits of equipment and ensuring your calibration is up to date. I sort of take your point. Equipment is so sophisticated these days. It is tricky to have an ability to necessarily calibrate some of that equipment. So again, happy for some submission on the wording of that. Surveyors still need to be the experts in the measurement game. Those competencies are there because they really underpin the surveys that we undertake on the cadaster to ensure the confidence that everyone needs. So happy to receive some feedback on whether we've got the wording right there as well. So that's the end of the questions. I just want to reiterate some of the things that Neale said around those competencies, particularly the extra ones around professional conduct, communication, and profession. Yeah, again, over the years, the board has seen a number of people come before them getting unstuck, and there have been some gaps in how the competencies had been written up in the previous standards, and so we particularly a lot of people, myself included, really like the idea of good survey practice and doing things right and that. But I guess when you drill down into that, you realise that it can be quite subjective and it's dynamic. It changes over time. But there are some really important aspects of that we need to try and capture, and particularly around ensuring continual professional development, having really good quality assurance systems in place, and actively supervising the people that undertake the parts of a cadastral survey for you. So we've kind of wanted to incorporate that into the standards to really de-risk. It's all about risks to the cadastre. We get involved, we work on the cadastre, and it needs to be strong and secure. And so it's a little bit more background as to where those extra competencies have come from. So I'd be really keen to get your feedback on those. But the question like there about professional misconduct, that's actually spelled out quite succinctly in Schedule 2 of the Cadastral Survey Act, what professional misconduct is. So we don't need to reiterate that there. But that's the end of the questions. I'll hand back to Jenny to finish us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I'd now like to hand back to Neale, who would just like to say a few final words. So here you go, Neale.
Thank you, everybody, for your attendance. It's really encouraging, the amount of people that are listening in, and I apologise for the hiccup in the middle there. That was a fault at my end. I hope it didn't upset things too much. So have a think, and if you feel strongly or otherwise, please make a submission. Craig and I would really appreciate it. The board would really appreciate receiving those. So thank you for your time, and I'll just hand back to Jenny for any closing stuff that she needs to do.